Hello, and welcome to the Floating Formats Test Cases training. In this lesson, I'll walk you through the basic QA checklist for floating formats. These are the testing procedures that you will use while QAing creatives that hover over a web page. At the end of this training, you will know how to perform a full QA on all interstitial formats such as the standing floating, in-page with floating, and multi-floating formats. There are several test cases that are specific to the floating formats that you will need to know. We'll begin with a quick overview of the three different types of floating formats and their differences. Then, we'll review the close functionality tests, followed by the setup guidelines for floaters. Then, we'll review the best practices and metrics for floating formats. These are the three different types of interstitial floating formats that you can use in DoubleClick Studio. Each type of interstitial add allows greater flexibility than most other formats. There are some exceptions for the in-page with floating and multi-floating formats, but unless I tell you otherwise, you should QA each floating creative using the test cases we'll review today. A standard floating creative is a SWF that floats on top of the publisher's content. Because it isn't assigned to a fixed add slot, it can be almost any shape or size, and you can place it anywhere over a publisher's content. An important piece to note is that the standard floating format is the only format that does not use a backup image. If a user has the Flash Player disabled, the floating panel will not display. An in-page with floating creative uses both an in-page and a floating creative in one Studio Add format. This allows you to deliver two creative units to one page at the same time. Since they're uploaded together in DoubleClick Studio, we refer to the individual creatives as companions. This setup lets you open and close the floater from within the in-page asset. Multi-floating creatives consist of a maximum of 4 floating files that work as a single creative delivery. It's unique in that you're free to position any of the assets that make up the creative, and only one interstitial creative is counted when you serve it, even though you can use multiple formats. The creatives commonly border or surround a page's content. And like the standard floating creatives, multi-floating creatives can also move with the content or stay locked on a page as the user scrolls. You should check if and when the interstitial floating panel automatically closes without user interaction by timing how long the floater is displayed. An auto-close prevents the ad from blocking the website content for too long, especially if there is no user interaction with the ad. If publisher specs are not available, DoubleClick recommends that floating creatives auto-close no longer than 15 seconds after loading. There are 2 setup checks that are specific to the floating formats. Testing the setup of a multi-floating creative is always done ad hoc because it can contain assets that mimic the functionality of other formats. For instance, if a multi-floating ad contains assets that are expandable, you should also QA the creative using the test cases that we've reviewed in the lesson on expanding formats. Publishers need full functionality in order to independently position the different assets of a multi-floating or in-page with floating format. As a result, you should verify that each type of floating creative was uploaded using its corresponding floating format in DoubleClick Studio. DoubleClick strongly recommends that you gather site-specific specifications before you QA the floating creatives. However, if publisher specs are not available, you can avoid potential live issues by checking creatives with our best practices and LCDs for floating formats. Unlike other rich media formats, floating creatives can never use a polite load. Floating creatives automatically wait for a page to load before they render on a site, and a polite load could delay the ad serving. This can cause a user to go elsewhere before the ad appears, providing a poor user experience on the site. You can check that the creative does not have a polite load in the Files tab in the Creative Properties. To verify that the div layer has collapsed, open and close the floating asset. Check if the div layer is left open by right-clicking over the area which the floating creative covered. If it did not successfully close, you should see the Flash Settings menu when right-clicking over the area. Next, check the creative for clickable transparent areas that unexpectedly trigger an exit. This is done by clicking different parts around the floater that blend in with the web page. If an exit fires in a transparent area, DoubleClick recommends revising the creative so that the background exits are limited to areas that contain visible content. Otherwise, this may cause a bad user experience and publishers may reject the creative. There are a few tracking metrics that are specific to floating ads that you should check as part of your tracking tests. The first you should check for is the Rich Media Code Serves, which is unique to the floating creatives. The code serves counter tracks the number of times that the code for an interstitial ad is served to a user's browser. This may be greater than or equal to the number of impressions that are delivered because, in some cases, the code for an interstitial ad is served to a user's browser but the ad isn't displayed. As a result, the code can be served without an impression being counted. You should check that both the number of the code serves and delivered impressions track properly so that the campaign metrics accurately reflect the creative serve ratio. The next metric is the Rich Media Manual Close Counter, which you should recall from the lesson on the expanding test cases. Check the output console to see if the manual close counter triggers when a user manually closes the floating panel. Look out for any unintended events or exits that may fire, such as a background click-through. If an exit is triggered after clicking the close button, the creative should be rejected. The last metric you should check is the Rich Media Display Timer. This is usually included in most creatives, but it is slightly different when using ads with multiple assets, such as the in-page with floating and the multi-floating formats. For these two formats, the total display time is only counted when the floating asset is displayed. And as you would with an expanding creative, be sure to check that the floater timer does not continue to run after the panel is closed. I'll give you a quick demo of how to test the click-through and autoplay functionality, metrics, and div layer of a floating ad. I'll start by refreshing the creative and testing its background exit. The exit properly tracks in the output console, but it does not open the destination link. Additionally, the creative does not close on a click-through. These are both serious errors. As you can see, the floater auto-closed after 15 seconds, which is a requirement for creatives with animation. However, the Rich Media Display Timer is continuing to track in the output console. This usually indicates that the div layer did not properly collapse. I'll test the div layer. Yep. Sure enough, the Flash Settings menu appears when I right-click over the area previously covered by the floater. Whereas over here, I get the regular menu. DoubleClick would recommend rejecting this creative until the click-through and div layer issues are corrected.